Sometimes the most devastating rejection becomes the pathway to your greatest purpose. When Sarah Martinez received that phone call on a rainy Tuesday evening telling her she was being dropped from the emergency response team she had trained 3 years to join, she thought her world was ending. The voice on the other end was cold, professional, final. Budget cuts, they said. Not enough positions, they explained. It wasn't personal, they assured her. But what Sarah didn't know was that in exactly 17 days, her rejection would become the very reason dozens of people would go home to their families instead of becoming statistics on the evening news. Sometimes life doesn't give you the position you want because it's preparing you for the mission you're meant to fulfill. This is the true story of how one woman's courage, born from disappointment and fueled by an unshakable sense of duty, turned a career setback into a moment that would define not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. It's about the unexpected heroes among us, the ones who step up not because it's their job, but because it's their calling. Get ready to discover how the worst day of Sarah's professional life became the foundation for the most important day of her entire existence. Sarah Martinez stared at the phone in her hand, the dial tone echoing in her small apartment like a death sentence. 3 years of training, countless hours of studying emergency protocols, weekend seminars on disaster response, and physical conditioning that had pushed her body to its limits. All of it had just been reduced to a 5-minute phone call that ended with, "We've decided to go in a different direction." She set the phone down on her kitchen counter with trembling hands and walked to the window overlooking the industrial district where she had grown up. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but all Sarah could see was the gray uncertainty of her future. At 28, she had devoted her entire adult life to one goal: becoming a certified emergency response coordinator for the county. It wasn't just a career choice, it was a calling that had been born from tragedy. When Sarah was 15, a gas leak explosion had torn through her neighborhood, claiming 4 lives and injuring dozens more. She had watched helplessly as neighbors ran in circles, not knowing how to help, while emergency responders struggled to coordinate rescue efforts in the chaos. That day, she had made herself a promise. She would learn how to be the calm in the storm, the voice that brought order when everything fell apart. Now, sitting in her apartment surrounded by emergency response manuals and certificates that suddenly felt worthless, Sarah felt that promise crumbling. The county had hired only 3 new coordinators from a pool of over 50 candidates. Despite her perfect test scores and glowing recommendations from her instructors, she hadn't made the cut. The official reason was budget constraints, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her working-class background and state school education had worked against her in a field that seemed to favor candidates from more prestigious programs. The next morning brought no relief. Sarah called her mentor, Captain Rodriguez, who had encouraged her to apply for the position in the first place. His voice was heavy with disappointment when he answered. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I fought for you in that room, but the decision came from higher up. Politics, you know how it is." "What am I supposed to do now?" Sarah asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "I've spent everything on this training. I don't have a backup plan." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "There might be something else. It's not what you wanted, but the Riverside Manufacturing Complex is looking for a safety coordinator. It's private sector, less prestige, but the pay is decent and you'd be using your skills." Sarah felt her heart sink further. Riverside Manufacturing was known throughout the county as a struggling facility with a poor safety record. It wasn't the heroic emergency response work she had dreamed of. It was filing reports and conducting safety drills for workers who probably wouldn't take her seriously. But with student loans breathing down her neck and rent due in 2 weeks, she didn't have the luxury of being picky. 3 days later, Sarah found herself walking through the gates of Riverside Manufacturing, wearing her best professional outfit and carrying a briefcase filled with copies of her certifications. The complex was larger than she had expected. 5 massive buildings connected by a network of pipes, conveyors, and walkways. The air hummed with the constant noise of machinery, and she could smell the acrid scent of chemicals that she couldn't identify. Her new supervisor, Janet Walsh, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked at the plant for over 20 years. She greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and a skeptical look. "So you're the emergency response expert who's going to whip our safety program into shape," she said, not bothering to hide her doubt. "Let me guess. You learned everything you know from textbooks and simulation exercises." Sarah straightened her shoulders, determined not to let Janet's attitude intimidate her. "I've completed over 300 hours of field training and emergency simulation. I may not have years of experience, but I know my protocols." Janet laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Protocols are great until real life hits you in the face. Come on, let me show you what you're working with." The tour that followed was both enlightening and terrifying. Riverside Manufacturing produced industrial chemicals and cleaning compounds, processes that involved high-pressure systems, volatile materials, and temperatures that could kill a person in seconds. The safety equipment was outdated, many of the emergency exits were partially blocked by machinery, and Sarah noticed at least a dozen OSHA violations in the first building alone. The workers were a mix of long-time employees who had developed their own ways of doing things, and newer hires who seemed to have received minimal safety training. When Janet introduced Sarah as the new safety coordinator, she was met with polite nods and barely concealed eye rolls. It was clear that safety coordinators had come and gone before, and no one expected her to last long enough to make any real changes. Sarah's first week was a series of small battles and minor victories. She spent her days reviewing incident reports that painted a picture of a workplace where accidents were treated as inevitable rather than preventable. Workers told her stories of near misses and close calls that had never been officially reported. The more she learned about the plant's operations, the more concerned she became about the potential for a major disaster. Her evenings were spent in her apartment, poring over building schematics and safety protocols, looking for ways to improve emergency response procedures on a shoestring budget. She created new evacuation plans that accounted for the plant's confusing layout and identified critical points where emergency equipment needed to be upgraded or relocated. But her suggestions were met with resistance at every turn. Plant management was focused on production quotas and profit margins, not on spending money to fix problems that hadn't happened yet. When Sarah presented her initial safety assessment to the plant manager, Hendricks, he listened politely and then filed her recommendations in what she was certain was a drawer that would never be opened again. "Martinez," he said, adjusting his tie, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but we need to be realistic about costs. The plant is already operating on thin margins. Unless there's an immediate safety violation that could shut us down, major changes will have to wait for next year's budget." Sarah left that meeting feeling defeated. She had gone from dreaming of coordinating disaster response for entire communities to being ignored about basic safety measures in a single facility. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she should cut her losses and find a completely different career path. But something kept her going. Maybe it was the memory of her teenage promise, or maybe it was the faces of the workers she saw every day. People like Maria, a single mother who worked the night shift to pay for her daughter's medical treatments, or Tommy, a young father who talked constantly about his twin boys and seemed to take unnecessary risks because he was always rushing to finish his tasks. Sarah began to realize that her job was more important than she had initially thought. These weren't just workers following safety protocols. They were real people with families who depended on them, coming home safely every day. If something went wrong at Riverside Manufacturing, it wouldn't just be a statistic or a news story. It would be Maria's daughter losing her mother, or Tommy's twins growing up without their father. Slowly, Sarah started to build relationships with the workers. Instead of trying to enforce changes from the top down, she began working from the bottom up. She started bringing donuts to the break room and listening to workers' concerns during their breaks. She learned their names, asked about their families, and genuinely tried to understand the challenges they faced on the job. Maria was the first to really open up to her. One evening, as Sarah was doing her final walkthrough of the night shift, she found Maria sitting in the break room looking exhausted. "Long day?" Sarah asked, sitting down across from her. Maria looked up, surprised that the safety coordinator was taking time to chat. "Every day is long when you're worried about making a mistake," she said. "Some of these machines, if something goes wrong, you don't get a second chance." That conversation led to others, and Sarah began to understand the real safety issues at the plant. Workers were afraid to report problems because they didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. They were often pressured to work faster than was safe, and they had developed workarounds for broken or inadequate equipment that put them at risk. Armed with this new understanding, Sarah changed her approach. Instead of writing formal reports that would be ignored, she focused on small practical improvements that she could implement without going through management. She reorganized emergency equipment to make it more accessible, created simple safety checklists that workers could actually use, and started conducting informal training sessions during break times. Word began to spread that the new safety coordinator was different. Workers started coming to her with concerns and suggestions. She learned about equipment that had been malfunctioning for months, shortcuts that had become dangerous habits, and near misses that had never been reported. For the first time since starting at Riverside, Sarah felt like she was making a real difference. But she also became increasingly aware of just how precarious the situation really was. The plant was a disaster waiting to happen, held together by the skill and vigilance of workers who had learned to navigate around problems that should have been fixed years ago. Sarah found herself staying late, double-checking systems and trying to identify the most critical vulnerabilities. It was during one of these late-night inspections that Sarah discovered the problem that would change everything. While reviewing maintenance records for Building 3, she noticed an inconsistency in the inspection reports for the main chemical storage area. The pressure readings didn't match up between different reports, and there were gaps in the inspection schedule that didn't make sense. The next day, she decided to investigate personally. Building 3 housed the plant's primary chemical storage and mixing operations, the most dangerous area of the entire complex. As she walked through the facility with her clipboard and safety equipment, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the main pressure relief valves showed signs of stress that hadn't been documented in any of the recent inspection reports. Sarah spent the next 3 days conducting a thorough review of Building 3's safety systems, and what she found terrified her. Multiple critical systems were operating outside of safe parameters. Maintenance had been deferred on essential equipment, and the automatic safety shutdowns had been bypassed to avoid production delays. It was a perfect storm of neglect and cost-cutting that could result in a catastrophic failure. When she presented her findings to Janet and Mr. Hendricks, their response was predictably dismissive. The plant has been operating for 15 years without a major incident, Mr. Hendricks said. These systems have built-in redundancies. You're being overly cautious. But Sarah knew she was right. Her training had taught her to recognize the warning signs of system failure, and everything she was seeing pointed to an imminent disaster. The question was what she could do about it, when everyone in authority seemed determined to ignore the danger. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with her emergency response manuals spread out on her coffee table, trying to figure out her next move. She could report her concerns to OSHA, but that would take weeks to investigate and would certainly cost her the job. She could try to go over management's head to the corporate office, but she doubted they would be any more receptive to spending money on safety upgrades. As she stared at the plant schematic spread out in front of her, Sarah realized that the rejection that had brought her to Riverside might not have been a setback after all. If she had gotten the county position, she would be responding to emergencies after they happened. Here, she had the chance to prevent one from happening in the first place. The question was whether anyone would listen to her in time. The morning of October 15 started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Manufacturing. But Sarah Martinez felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach that she couldn't shake. For the past 2 weeks, she had been documenting every safety concern she could find, building an ironclad case for immediate action on Building 3's critical systems. Her reports were detailed, her evidence was clear, and her recommendations were reasonable. Yet management continued to treat her concerns as the overreactions of an inexperienced coordinator. Sarah arrived at the plant 40 minutes early, as had become her habit. She needed the quiet time before the shift changes to review overnight reports and check on the equipment that worried her most. The security guard, an elderly man named Pete, who had worked at the plant for 12 years, nodded to her as she badged in through the main entrance. "You're here early again," Pete observed, looking up from his newspaper. "Everything okay?" Sarah paused. Pete was one of the few people at the plant who seemed to take her seriously, probably because he had seen more close calls than anyone else. "Pete, if something were to go wrong in Building 3, how long would it take for emergency responders to get here?" "Depends on what kind of emergency. Fire department is about 8 minutes. Paramedics may be 6, but if it's something chemical, he shook his head. They'd have to call in the hazmat team from the county. That's 30 minutes minimum, maybe 45 if traffic's bad. Why do you ask? Just running through scenarios, Sarah said, but Pete's concerned expression told her he wasn't buying her casual tone. As Sarah made her way to Building 3, she noticed that the morning shift was already starting to arrive. Workers parked their cars and walked toward the various buildings, lunchboxes in hand, most of them looking like they needed at least 2 more hours of sleep. She recognized many of the faces now. Carlos, who worked in chemical mixing and was saving money for his wedding. Jennifer, a recent college graduate who was working to pay off student loans. Bill, a 20-year veteran who knew the plant's systems better than anyone. These people trusted that someone was looking out for their safety. They showed up every day, did their jobs, and assumed that the people in charge were making sure everything was properly maintained and monitored. The weight of that trust was becoming heavier every day for Sarah, especially when she knew that trust was being betrayed. In Building 3, Sarah began her morning inspection routine. She checked pressure gauges, reviewed overnight automated reports, and visually inspected the equipment that she was most concerned about. The pressure relief valve that had first caught her attention was showing even more signs of stress. The metal around the connection points was discolored, and she could swear she heard a faint whistling sound that hadn't been there the week before. Sarah pulled out her tablet and documented everything with photos and detailed notes. She measured temperatures, recorded pressure readings, and noted any sounds or vibrations that seemed unusual. By the time the morning shift was fully underway, she had compiled yet another report that painted a clear picture of systems operating beyond their safe limits. At 10:30 a.m., Sarah requested an emergency meeting with Janet Walsh and Mr. Hendricks. She had decided that if they wouldn't listen to her written reports, maybe a face-to-face presentation would get their attention. She prepared her tablet with photos, data charts, and a timeline showing how the problems in Building 3 were getting progressively worse. The meeting was held in Mr. Hendricks's office, a small space with faded corporate motivational posters and a desk covered in production reports. Janet sat with her arms crossed, already looking annoyed before Sarah had said a word. Hendricks glanced at his watch, making it clear that he didn't have much time for this discussion. "I need you to understand that we're looking at a potential catastrophic failure," Sarah began, pulling up her documentation on the tablet. "The pressure relief systems in Building 3 are compromised, and if they fail during peak production, we could be looking at an explosion that would affect not just our workers, but the surrounding community." Mr. Hendricks barely glanced at her photos. "Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate your diligence, but you've been here for less than 2 months. These systems have been operating safely for years. I think you're misinterpreting what you're seeing." "I'm not misinterpreting anything," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I have documentation showing that pressure readings have increased by 15% over the past month alone. The relief valve is showing signs of metal fatigue, and the automatic shutdown system has been bypassed." Janet leaned forward, her expression stern. "Those shutdowns were interfering with production schedules. The workers know how to monitor the systems manually. We've never had a problem before." "You've never had a problem that resulted in a disaster," Sarah corrected. "But your incident reports show multiple near misses that could have been much worse if circumstances had been slightly different. We're not just lucky. We're playing with fire." Mr. Hendricks closed Sarah's tablet and slid it back across the desk to her. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to file your concerns with the appropriate documentation, and we'll review them for next quarter's maintenance budget. In the meantime, you need to focus on your actual job, which is conducting routine safety inspections and filing reports, not trying to shut down our most profitable production line." Sarah felt her face flush with frustration. "What if next quarter is too late? What if something happens this week?" "Nothing is going to happen this week," Janet said dismissively. "You're creating problems where none exist. I think you need to remember that you're here because no one else wanted this job, not because you're some kind of safety expert." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but they also crystallized something for her. Janet was right that she had ended up at Riverside because of rejection and desperation, but that didn't make her observations any less valid. If anything, her fresh perspective was allowing her to see problems that longtime employees had become blind to. After the meeting, Sarah sat in her small office feeling more frustrated than ever. She had done everything right, documented problems, followed proper procedures, presented evidence clearly, but the people with authority to act were refusing to listen. She began to wonder if there was another way to approach the problem. That afternoon, Sarah decided to talk directly to the workers in Building 3. If management wouldn't listen to her, maybe she could at least make sure the people most at risk were aware of the dangers. She started with Carlos, who was operating one of the chemical mixing stations near the problematic pressure relief valve. "Carlos, can I ask you something?" Sarah said during his break. "Have you noticed any changes in the equipment lately? Different sounds, smells, anything unusual?" Carlos looked around nervously before answering. "Well, there's been this whistling sound for the past few weeks, and sometimes the pressure gauge jumps around more than usual. But Janet said it's just normal variation. What would you do if you heard an alarm or saw pressure readings getting too high? We're supposed to shut down the mixing process and call for a supervisor." But Carlos hesitated. "Last month when I did that, I got written up for stopping production without authorization. They said the readings were still within acceptable limits." Sarah felt her heart sink. Not only were the safety systems compromised, but workers were being discouraged from following safety protocols. It was a perfect recipe for disaster, and she was apparently the only one who could see it clearly. Over the next few days, Sarah had similar conversations with other workers in Building 3. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Multiple employees had noticed signs that equipment was not operating normally, but they had been told their concerns were unfounded. Some had stopped reporting problems altogether after being criticized for causing unnecessary production delays. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her daily inspections and noticed that the situation was getting worse. The pressure relief valve was now making audible sounds that could be heard even over the normal machinery noise. Temperature readings were fluctuating more wildly, and she observed what appeared to be small leaks in connections that should have been sealed tight. On Friday afternoon, Sarah made a decision that she knew could end her career at Riverside. She called the county emergency management office and asked to speak with someone about potential industrial hazards. The person who answered transferred her to Captain Rodriguez, her old mentor. "Sarah, what's going on? Are you calling about a job opening?" "No, Captain. I need to report a potential emergency situation at Riverside Manufacturing. I think we're looking at the possibility of a major chemical release or explosion." There was a long pause. "That's a serious accusation, Sarah. Do you have documentation to support it?" "I have weeks of documentation showing critical safety systems operating outside safe parameters. I've reported it to plant management, but they're refusing to take action." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "You know I trust your judgment, but I can't launch an official investigation based solely on your concerns. If the plant management says everything is safe, county emergency services can't override that without evidence of immediate danger. What if I'm right and something happens? What if people get hurt because everyone was too worried about stepping on toes to prevent a disaster? Sarah, you need to be very careful here. If you're wrong, you could face serious legal consequences for filing a false report. And if you're right," he sighed, "if you're right, then you need to document everything and be prepared to provide detailed evidence to investigators after the fact." That weekend, Sarah barely slept. She spent Saturday and Sunday reviewing her documentation, double-checking her calculations, and researching similar industrial accidents to see if her concerns were justified. Everything she read confirmed her worst fears. The combination of problems she had identified at Riverside Manufacturing matched the conditions that had preceded several major industrial disasters in recent years. On Sunday evening, Sarah made another difficult decision. She called Maria, who was working the night shift, and asked her to meet during her break. When Maria arrived in the break room, Sarah was waiting with a folder full of documents. "Maria, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. I believe there's a serious safety problem in Building 3, and management isn't taking it seriously." Maria's eyes widened. "What kind of problem?" Sarah explained the pressure relief valve issues, the compromised safety systems, and the increasing signs of equipment stress. She showed Maria the documentation and explained what it could mean if the systems failed during operation. "Why are you telling me this?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you have a daughter who needs her mother to come home safely. Because you have the right to know when you're being put at unnecessary risk. And because if something happens, I want at least some people to know what the warning signs are. Maria was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photos and data that Sarah had compiled. Finally, she looked up with tears in her eyes. What should I do? Be extra vigilant. If you see anything unusual, pressure readings higher than normal, strange sounds, any kind of leak, don't wait for permission to shut down your station. Get out of the building and call for help, and tell the other workers you trust. That conversation was repeated several times over the next 2 days, as Sarah quietly warned the workers she had built relationships with. She was careful not to create panic, but she wanted them to be prepared to react quickly if something went wrong. By Wednesday morning, Sarah had developed a routine that consumed nearly every waking hour. She arrived at the plant early to conduct her own inspections, documented everything she observed throughout the day, and stayed late to review data and look for patterns. She was running on coffee and determination, driven by the knowledge that she might be the only thing standing between dozens of people and a preventable disaster. That morning, as she conducted her pre-shift inspection of Building 3, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The pressure relief valve that had been her primary concern was no longer just showing signs of stress. It was actively leaking. A thin stream of chemical vapor was visible around the connection point, and the metal was discolored in a way that indicated ongoing thermal stress. Sarah immediately documented the leak with photos and measurements, then went to find Janet Walsh. She found her in the main office, reviewing production schedules for the day. Janet, we have an active leak in Building 3. The pressure relief valve is compromised and needs immediate attention. Janet looked up from her paperwork with obvious irritation. How big is this leak? It's small right now, but it's getting worse. This valve is critical to preventing overpressurization of the entire chemical storage system. If it fails completely, there are backup systems, Janet interrupted. And you said the leak is small. We'll put it on the maintenance schedule for next week. Next week could be too late. This needs to be addressed today. Janet stood up and looked Sarah in the eye. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to say this one more time. You are not authorized to shut down production lines. You are not authorized to make emergency maintenance decisions. Your job is to observe and report, which you've done. Now let me do my job and manage this facility. Sarah left that meeting knowing that she had exhausted all official channels. Management was not going to act, no matter how clear the danger became. She had followed every proper procedure, documented every concern, and presented evidence that any reasonable person would find compelling. But she was dealing with people who seemed more interested in protecting their positions than protecting their workers. As Sarah walked back toward Building 3, she realized that she was facing the most important decision of her professional life. She could continue following proper procedures and hope that nothing bad happened, or she could take matters into her own hands and accept the consequences. Either way, she would have to live with the results for the rest of her life. The morning shift was just getting underway, and Sarah could see workers settling into their routines, unaware that they were working next to a system that was slowly failing. She thought about Maria's daughter, about Carlos's wedding plans, about all the families who were counting on these people to come home safely at the end of the day. Sarah checked her watch. It was 7:45 a.m., and Building 3 was operating at full capacity. According to the production schedule, they would be running continuous operations until 6 p.m., putting maximum stress on all the systems she was worried about. If the pressure relief valve failed during peak production, the results could be catastrophic. As she stood there watching the workers begin their day, Sarah Martinez made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to stop following the rules and start trusting her training, her instincts, and her commitment to the people whose safety had been placed in her hands. The question was no longer whether she would act, but how she could act effectively before it was too late. At 11:47 a.m. on Thursday, October 22nd, Sarah Martinez heard the sound that confirmed her worst fears. She was conducting her routine midday inspection of Building 3 when a sharp metallic ping echoed through the chemical processing area, followed by a hissing noise that made every worker in the vicinity stop what they were doing and look around nervously. Sarah ran toward the source of the sound. her heart pounding as she realized it was coming from the pressure relief valve she had been monitoring for weeks. When she reached the valve assembly, what she saw made her stomach drop. The leak she had reported to Janet 2 days earlier had grown significantly larger, and now there were visible stress fractures spreading along the metal housing. Worse still, the pressure gauge was reading 15% higher than it should have been during normal operation. "Everyone stop what you're doing and step back from this area," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. The workers looked confused, but something in her tone made them comply immediately. Carlos approached her, his face pale with concern. "Sarah, what's happening? That sound? It wasn't normal, was it?" "No, it wasn't normal," Sarah said, her mind racing through emergency protocols. "I need you to help me clear this area while I figure out our next steps." Sarah knew she was at a critical decision point. According to company policy, she should report the situation to Janet and wait for instructions. But her training told her that waiting could be deadly. The pressure relief valve was the primary safety mechanism preventing overpressurization of the entire chemical storage system. If it failed completely while the system was under full load, the resulting explosion could level Building 3 and potentially damage the surrounding structures. She pulled out her phone and called Janet's office, but the call went straight to voicemail. Janet was in a meeting with corporate executives who were visiting the plant that day. Sarah tried Mr. Hendricks next, but his assistant told her he was unavailable and asked if she wanted to leave a message. "Tell him that Building 3 needs to be evacuated immediately," Sarah said. "We have a critical safety situation that requires immediate attention." "I'll pass along the message," the assistant replied in a tone that suggested she got dramatic calls from the safety coordinator regularly. Sarah hung up and realized she was on her own. She could wait for management to return her calls and hope the valve held together. Or she could trust her training and take action to protect the workers under her responsibility. When she looked at the stress fractures that seemed to be growing by the minute, her decision became clear. "Carlos, I need you to help me shut down the chemical mixing operations in this section, and I need you to do it right now." Carlos looked around nervously. "Sarah, you know I can't shut down production without authorization. I'll get fired." "If we don't shut it down, you might not live to get fired," Sarah replied, her voice steady but urgent. "I'm taking full responsibility for this decision. Please trust me." The sincerity in her voice must have convinced him, because Carlos nodded and began the shutdown sequence for his mixing station. Other workers saw what was happening and gathered around, asking questions and looking increasingly worried. Sarah climbed onto an equipment platform where she could address all the workers in the area. "Listen to me carefully," she called out. "We have a critical safety situation with the pressure relief valve. I'm ordering an immediate shutdown of all operations in this section of Building 3. I need everyone to secure your stations and move to the break room while we address this problem." "Who authorized this shutdown?" called out Jennifer, the recent college graduate who always followed procedures to the letter. "Shouldn't we wait for Janet to get back?" "I'm authorizing it," Sarah said firmly. "As the safety coordinator for this facility, I have the authority to stop operations when I identify an immediate danger to worker safety. And right now, continuing to operate this equipment poses an unacceptable risk to everyone in this building." Some workers continued to hesitate, caught between their training to follow orders and their growing sense that something was seriously wrong. Sarah could see them looking at each other uncertainly, and she realized that her credibility as a leader was being tested in real time. It was Maria who broke the impasse. "If Sarah says there's danger, I believe her," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She's been the only person in management who's actually listened to our concerns about the equipment. If she's worried enough to stop production, then I'm worried too." Maria's endorsement seemed to tip the balance, and other workers began shutting down their stations. But even as they secured their equipment, Sarah could see confusion and fear on their faces. Many of them had worked at the plant for years and had never experienced an emergency shutdown. They were looking to her for guidance, and she realized that her next decisions would determine whether everyone went home safely that day. As the immediate area was being cleared, Sarah called the county emergency management office and asked to be transferred directly to Captain Rodriguez. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Captain, this is Sarah Martinez at Riverside Manufacturing. I'm implementing an emergency shutdown of Building 3 due to imminent failure of a critical pressure relief valve. I need hazmat teams here immediately. Sarah, slow down. Are you saying there's an active chemical release? Not yet, but I believe we're minutes away from a catastrophic failure. The pressure relief valve is showing stress fractures and the system is operating at dangerous pressure levels. I've cleared the immediate area, but if this valve fails, we could be looking at an explosion that affects the entire complex. Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Sarah, you know I trust your judgment, but calling out emergency response teams is a big deal. Have you gotten authorization from plant management? Plant management is in meetings and not responding to emergency calls. Captain, I don't have time to navigate corporate bureaucracy. People's lives are at stake. Okay, I'm dispatching units to your location. ETA is 15 minutes for the first responders, 30 minutes for the full hazmat team. But Sarah, you need to understand that if this turns out to be a false alarm, there will be serious consequences. I understand, Sarah replied. I'll take full responsibility for this decision. After hanging up, Sarah realized that she had just committed career suicide. If she was wrong about the severity of the situation, she would be fired, possibly sued, and certainly blacklisted from any future safety positions. But if she was right, her actions might save dozens of lives and prevent an environmental disaster. With emergency responders on the way, Sarah focused on making sure Building 3 was properly evacuated. She went from station to station, helping workers secure their equipment and ensuring that everyone understood the situation. Some workers were angry about losing a day's pay, while others seemed genuinely frightened by the implications of an emergency shutdown. Bill, the 20-year veteran who knew the plant's systems better than anyone, approached Sarah as she was checking the final stations. I've been working here since this building opened, he said quietly. I've seen a lot of near misses over the years, but I've never seen anyone with the guts to actually stop production. You either know something the rest of us don't, or you're crazy. Maybe both, Sarah replied. But I'd rather be crazy and alive than right and dead. Bill nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I've been hearing that valve making noise for weeks. I reported it to maintenance, but they said it wasn't priority. If you're right about this, there's going to be hell to pay for a lot of people. As the last workers were clearing out of Building 3, Sarah heard the sound she had been dreading. The metallic ping from earlier was replaced by a louder cracking noise, followed by a sudden drop in pressure readings across multiple systems. She ran back to the valve assembly and saw that the stress fractures had spread significantly, and the leak had become a steady stream of chemical vapor. Sarah immediately activated the building's emergency ventilation system and sounded the general alarm for Building 3. The piercing sound of the alarm echoed through the complex, and she could see workers from other buildings looking toward Building 3 with concern and confusion. Her phone rang. It was Janet, and she sounded furious. What the hell do you think you're doing, Martinez? I just got word that you've shut down Building 3 and called emergency responders. You had no authorization for this action. Janet, the pressure relief valve is actively failing. I have visual confirmation of stress fractures and increasing chemical vapor release. This system is going to fail catastrophically if we don't take immediate action. You've overstepped your authority in the worst possible way. Do you have any idea how much this shutdown is costing us? And calling county emergency services without approval. You're fired. Effective immediately. Fine, Sarah replied. Fire me if you want, but you need to keep everyone away from Building 3 until the emergency responders can assess the situation. Sarah hung up and realized that her brief career at Riverside Manufacturing was over. But she also realized that she didn't care. For the first time since arriving at the plant, she felt like she was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. At 12:23 p.m., the first emergency responders arrived at Riverside Manufacturing. Captain Rodriguez was among them, along with a team of firefighters and paramedics. Sarah met them at the main gate and quickly briefed them on the situation. The affected area is clear of personnel, but the pressure relief valve is actively failing, she reported. I have documentation of increasing pressure readings and visual confirmation of stress fractures. The system contains approximately 1,500 gallons of industrial cleaning compounds. Captain Rodriguez looked toward Building 3 where the emergency alarm was still sounding. Show me what you're seeing. Sarah led the emergency team to a safe viewing position where they could observe the failing valve assembly. Even from 50 yards away, the vapor leak was visible, and the cracking sounds were audible over the ambient noise of the plant. One of the firefighters, a veteran named Thompson, whistled low. "I've seen this kind of failure before. That valve is going to let go completely, probably within the hour." Captain Rodriguez turned to Sarah with a mixture of respect and concern. "Sarah, you did the right thing, but you know there's going to be fallout from this." "I know," Sarah replied. "But everyone is safe, and that's what matters." The hazmat team arrived at 12:45 p.m. and immediately began setting up containment equipment around Building 3. They confirmed Sarah's assessment that the pressure relief valve was in imminent danger of catastrophic failure and began the process of safely venting the chemical storage system to reduce pressure. At 1:15 p.m., just as the hazmat team was completing their pressure relief procedures, the valve assembly finally failed completely. The sound was like a gunshot, followed by a roar, as pressurized chemicals vented through the failed system. If the building had still been occupied, the exposure to concentrated chemical vapors would have sent dozens of workers to the hospital, and the explosion that would have followed could have killed several people. Instead, thanks to Sarah's decision to act on her training and instincts, the only damage was to equipment that could be replaced. The hazmat team contained the chemical release within 2 hours, and Building 3 was declared safe for limited access by late afternoon. When the excitement was over and the emergency responders were packing up their equipment, Captain Rodriguez found Sarah sitting on a bench outside the plant's main office. She looked exhausted but oddly peaceful. "You know you saved lives today," he said, sitting down beside her. "I know," Sarah replied, "but I also know I'm probably going to be sued for the cost of the emergency response and the lost production." Captain Rodriguez smiled. "Actually, I don't think that's going to be a problem. While you were dealing with the emergency, county inspectors took the opportunity to do a full safety review of the plant. They found dozens of violations that management will be required to fix before they can resume full operations. Your documentation of the problems was instrumental in identifying the broader safety issues." "What does that mean?" "It means that instead of being the person who caused an expensive false alarm, you're the person who prevented a major industrial accident and identified critical safety problems that could have affected the entire community. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some job offers in your future." End of footnote. 3 weeks later, Sarah was offered a position as a county emergency response coordinator, the same job she had been rejected for 6 months earlier. The hiring committee specifically cited her actions at Riverside Manufacturing as evidence of her ability to make difficult decisions under pressure and her commitment to public safety. On her first day at her new job, Sarah received a call from Maria. Building 3 had been completely renovated with new safety systems, and the entire plant was operating under much stricter safety protocols. More importantly, the workers had been given additional training and were encouraged to report safety concerns without fear of retaliation. "You know what the best part is?" Maria said. "Every worker in that plant knows that someone was looking out for us. Even when management wouldn't listen, even when it cost you your job, you put our safety first. That means everything to people like me." Sarah hung up and looked around her new office, which was filled with emergency response plans and county safety protocols. She thought about the path that had led her here, the rejection that had seemed like the end of her dreams, the job she had taken out of desperation, and the decision that had defined her character. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the most important thing you'll ever do. Sarah's rejection from her dream job had put her exactly where she needed to be when lives hung in the balance. Her courage hadn't just saved the workers at Riverside Manufacturing. It had shown her who she really was and what she was capable of achieving. In the end, being dropped from the roster had led her to discover that she didn't need anyone else's permission to be a hero. She just needed the courage to trust her training, follow her instincts, and put people's safety above her own career concerns. The teenage promise she had made to herself after the neighborhood explosion had finally been fulfilled, just not in the way she had originally imagined. She had indeed learned to be the calm in the storm, the voice that brought order when everything fell apart. And in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the most important qualification for saving lives isn't the job title on your business card, it's the willingness to do what's right when no one else will.